6 months later, I was sitting in my garden reading the morning paper when I saw the headline: Local manufacturing CEO arrested for tax evasion, $2.3 million owed to federal government. I set down my coffee and smiled for the first time since my termination. It had all started that Tuesday morning when Marcus Henderson made the mistake of firing the one person who knew where all the bodies were buried. My name is David Mitchell, and this is the story of how 25 years of loyalty turned into the most satisfying phone call I ever made to the IRS. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning 6 months ago. February 15th, 2024. I remember the date because it was exactly 25 years and 3 months since I'd first walked through the doors of Henderson Manufacturing as their new junior accountant. Fresh out of college, eager to prove myself, ready to build a career. Marcus Henderson was different back then. Younger, hungrier, but still carrying himself with that same arrogance that would eventually be his downfall. His father had built the company from nothing, a small machine shop that gradually grew into a mid-sized manufacturing operation specializing in automotive parts. When old man Henderson passed in 2010, Marcus inherited everything, and that's when things started to change. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you the picture of that Tuesday morning. I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., just like I had every workday for the past 25 years. Henderson Manufacturing occupied a sprawling complex on the industrial side of town. The main office building, 2 manufacturing floors, and a warehouse that had been expanded 3 times since I'd started working there. My corner office on the 2nd floor overlooked the parking lot. I'd earned that view through 2.5 decades of perfect attendance, flawless financial reports, and the kind of institutional knowledge that makes companies run smoothly. I knew every vendor, every contract, every tax loophole we'd legally navigated, and unfortunately, every illegal maneuver Marcus had been pulling for the past 5 years. At 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. "David, could you come to conference room A? Bring your access cards and any company property you might have." It was Janet from HR, and her voice carried that carefully neutral tone they teach you in management seminars. I knew what this was. I'd been expecting it for months. You see, Marcus Henderson thought he was clever. He'd been gradually pushing out the older employees, the ones who remembered his father, the ones who knew how things used to be done, the ones who might ask uncomfortable questions about certain financial discrepancies that had been appearing with increasing frequency. I walked into that conference room with my head held high. Marcus was there, of course, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. Janet sat to his right with a manila folder thick with paperwork. There was also someone I didn't recognize, a young man in his 30s wearing a cheaper suit and the eager expression of someone about to get promoted into my position. "David," Marcus began, not quite meeting my eyes, "I want to thank you for your 25 years of dedicated service to Henderson Manufacturing. You've been instrumental in our growth and success." Here it comes, I thought. "However," he continued, "we're implementing some significant changes to our financial operations. We're bringing in new systems, new processes, and frankly, we need someone with a more contemporary skill set to oversee the transition." I almost laughed. Contemporary skill set. I was 58 years old, not 80. I'd been updating our accounting software, implementing new financial tracking systems, and keeping us compliant with an increasingly complex web of federal regulations for the better part of 3 decades. But I knew this wasn't really about my skills. This was about the fact that I'd been asking too many questions about the cash flow reports, about the mysterious consulting fees being paid to companies I'd never heard of, about the sudden appearance of offshore accounts that weren't mentioned in our annual reports. "I understand," I said calmly. "What's the timeline?" Marcus looked relieved that I wasn't arguing. "Effective immediately. We've prepared a generous severance package, 6 months' salary plus your accrued vacation time. Brian here will be taking over your responsibilities. Brian. The eager young man gave me a nervous smile and a weak handshake. Poor kid had no idea what he was walking into. I signed the papers without drama. 25 years of my life reduced to a stack of legal documents and a direct deposit that would hit my account in 2 weeks. I cleaned out my office in 30 minutes. Family photos, a few books, my coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Accountant" that my daughter had given me for Father's Day. As I carried my cardboard box to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because for 5 years, I'd been carrying a burden that was eating me alive. For 5 years, I'd been watching Marcus Henderson steal from the federal government, knowing that my silence made me complicit, but also knowing that speaking up would cost me everything. Now I had nothing left to lose. Let me explain what I'd discovered, and why it had taken me so long to act on it. It started in 2019, about a year after we'd landed our biggest contract ever, a 3-year deal to supply automotive components to a major car manufacturer. The contract was worth $12 million annually, and it put Henderson Manufacturing on the map as a serious player in the industry. With contracts that size come federal regulations. Lots of them. We had to prove minority supplier partnerships, environmental compliance, worker safety standards, and detailed financial reporting that went far beyond what we'd ever done before. As the Chief Financial Officer, a title Marcus had given me in 2015, I was responsible for ensuring we met every requirement. I took that responsibility seriously. Maybe too seriously, as it turned out. The first red flag was subtle. In our quarterly reports to the Federal Contract Office, we were claiming reimbursements for diversity training and environmental compliance consulting, legitimate expenses that larger companies often incur. But when I tried to reconcile these expenses with our actual expenditures, something didn't add up. The invoices were real. The consulting companies existed. But when I dug deeper, I discovered that both consulting firms were registered to the same address, a mail forwarding service in Delaware. The principals listed on their business registrations were people I'd never heard of, but their signatures looked remarkably similar to Marcus Henderson's handwriting. I brought this to Marcus's attention privately. "These consulting expenses," I said, "I'm having trouble matching them to actual services rendered." He waved me off. "David, you worry too much. The government requires us to spend money on this compliance stuff anyway. We're just being creative about how we structure it." That should have been a bigger red flag than it was. But Marcus was the boss, and I'd been trained my entire career to trust the hierarchy. Besides, the amounts were relatively small, maybe $50,000 over the course of a year. Enough to notice, but not enough to feel like it was worth risking my job over. But it didn't stop there. By 2020, the phantom consulting fees had grown to over $200,000 annually. And they weren't the only issue anymore. Marcus had created what he called operational efficiency accounts, special funds designated for equipment upgrades, worker training, and facility improvements. On paper, these looked legitimate. We were indeed buying new equipment and upgrading our facilities. But the math didn't work. According to our federal reports, we'd spent $800,000 on new CNC machines in 2020. According to our actual bank records, we'd spent $400,000. The difference was being funneled through a complex network of shell companies that all traced back to accounts controlled by Marcus. He was stealing from every possible source. Federal contract reimbursements, tax credits for equipment purchases, even employee training funds that were supposed to go toward worker development programs. The most egregious discovery came in early 2021. I was reviewing our tax filings when I noticed that we'd claimed a $300,000 deduction for environmental remediation, cleanup work that was supposedly required after a chemical spill in our facility. There had been no chemical spill. I knew this because I'd been in charge of our environmental compliance for years. I knew every incident report, every safety inspection, every interaction with environmental regulators. We'd never had a spill serious enough to require remediation, let alone $300,000 worth of cleanup work. When I confronted Marcus about this, his demeanor changed completely. "David," he said, closing his office door and speaking in a tone I'd never heard from him before, "you need to understand something. The government takes a massive cut of our profits through taxes and regulations. All I'm doing is leveling the playing field. We're not hurting anyone. We're just keeping what's rightfully ours. Marcus, this is tax fraud. Federal contract fraud. If they catch us—" "They won't catch us," he interrupted, "as long as everyone on the team stays focused on the big picture. We're employing 150 people in this town. We're contributing to the local economy. A little creative accounting isn't hurting anyone." That conversation haunted me for months, because I realized that Marcus wasn't just stealing money. He was asking me to be complicit in a federal crime, and if I refused to sign off on these fraudulent reports, I'd lose my job. If I went along with it, I'd be risking federal prison. I chose a third option. I started documenting everything. For the next 3 years, I became a meticulous record keeper. Every fraudulent invoice, every fake consulting fee, every inflated expense report, I copied it all. Not just the documents themselves, but the digital paper trail that showed how the money flowed from our legitimate accounts into Marcus's personal network of shell companies. I opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town and filled it with evidence. USB drives containing financial records, printed copies of bank statements, even photographs of checks that Marcus had written to himself from company accounts. By the time Marcus fired me in February 2024, I had documented over $2.3 million in federal tax fraud, contract fraud, and embezzlement spanning 5 years. But I still hadn't done anything with the information. Why? Because I was scared. Federal whistleblower cases are complicated, messy affairs that can drag on for years. I'd heard stories of people who reported corporate fraud and ended up blacklisted from their entire industry. I was 58 years old with a mortgage and a daughter in college. I couldn't afford to become unemployable. But Marcus solved that problem for me when he fired me that Tuesday morning. Driving home from Henderson Manufacturing for the last time, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For 3 years, I'd been torn between my legal obligations, my financial security, and my moral compass. Now, with no job to lose and a severance package that would keep me afloat for 6 months, the choice became simple. I had a civic duty to report what I'd discovered, and I had a personal obligation to make sure Marcus Henderson faced consequences for betraying the trust of his employees, his community, and his government. That afternoon, I drove to my safety deposit box and retrieved 5 years' worth of evidence. That evening, I spent 4 hours organizing it all into a comprehensive package that told the story of Marcus Henderson's systematic fraud in clear, undeniable detail. On Wednesday morning, February 16, 2024, I called the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The federal government moves slowly, but when it comes to tax fraud, it moves with purpose. The IRS agent I spoke with, Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism you'd expect from someone who investigates financial crimes for a living. "Mr. Mitchell," she said after I'd finished my initial explanation, "these are serious allegations. Before we proceed, I need to ask you directly. Are you making this report in good faith, or is this related to your recent termination?" I'd expected this question. "Agent Rodriguez, I've been documenting this fraud for 3 years. I didn't come forward earlier because I was afraid of losing my job. Now that I've lost it anyway, I feel obligated to report what I know. And you have documentation to support these claims? I have everything. Bank records, invoices, email correspondence, tax filings. 5 years' worth of evidence that proves systematic fraud totaling over $2.3 million. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to bring everything to our field office. Can you be here this afternoon? That afternoon, I walked into the federal building downtown carrying 2 boxes of evidence that would destroy Marcus Henderson's life. Agent Rodriguez and her team spent 3 hours going through everything I'd brought, asking detailed questions about dates, amounts, and the specific mechanisms Marcus had used to hide his theft. This is comprehensive, Agent Rodriguez admitted after reviewing the 3rd box of documents. You've essentially done our investigation for us. The question now is whether you're willing to cooperate fully with a federal prosecution. What does that mean exactly? It means you'd likely be called as a witness if this goes to trial. Your testimony would be crucial to proving intent and establishing the timeline of the fraud. It also means that Marcus Henderson and his legal team will do everything they can to discredit you. I thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. Agent Rodriguez, I've been carrying this secret for 3 years. I'm ready to tell the truth. 3 weeks later, at 6:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning, I was drinking my coffee and reading the news when my phone rang. It was Agent Rodriguez. Mr. Mitchell, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're executing search warrants at Henderson Manufacturing this morning. This might be a good day for you to stay away from that part of town. I hung up and immediately drove to the coffee shop across the street from the Henderson Manufacturing Complex. I watched it all unfold from my car. 6 federal agents in windbreakers marked IRSCI walked through the front doors at 7:15 a.m. By 8 a.m., they were carrying out boxes of documents and computer equipment. Marcus Henderson arrived at 8:30 a.m., saw the federal agents in his lobby, and immediately called his lawyer. The whole thing took 6 hours. When it was over, Henderson Manufacturing's offices were sealed, its computers had been seized, and Marcus Henderson was downtown answering very uncomfortable questions about his creative accounting methods. The local news picked up the story that evening. Federal agents raid local manufacturing company in tax fraud investigation. The reporter stood in front of the Henderson Manufacturing sign, explaining that the IRS was investigating allegations of federal tax evasion and contract fraud. Marcus Henderson's lawyer issued a statement claiming his client was innocent and would be vigorously defending against these baseless accusations. But I knew better. I'd given the federal government a roadmap to Marcus's crimes, and they'd followed it straight to his door. Over the next few months, the investigation expanded. Federal prosecutors filed charges not just for tax evasion, but for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The shell companies Marcus had created to hide his theft were exposed, along with a network of fake consulting firms he'd used to justify the fraudulent expenses. Which brings me back to that morning 6 months later, sitting in my garden with my coffee and the newspaper. Local manufacturing CEO arrested for tax evasion, $2.3 million owed to federal government. The article was thorough. It explained how Marcus Henderson had systematically defrauded federal contracts over 5 years, using fake consulting firms and inflated expense reports to steal more than $2.3 million in taxpayer money. It mentioned that he'd been arrested at his home and was being held on $500,000 bail. But the part that made me smile was buried in the 3rd paragraph. The investigation was launched following a tip from a former employee who provided federal agents with detailed evidence of the alleged fraud scheme. I set down the paper and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 25 years of loyal service, ended by a boss who thought he was smarter than the federal government. 3 years of sleepless nights, wondering whether I should report what I'd discovered. 6 months of uncertainty, wondering whether I'd done the right thing. Now I knew I had. Marcus Henderson pled guilty to all charges 3 months later. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to the federal government. Henderson Manufacturing was sold to pay his debts, and 150 employees lost their jobs. I felt bad about the employees. They were innocent victims of Marcus's greed, just like I had been. But I didn't feel bad about Marcus. He'd stolen from every American taxpayer, betrayed the trust of his employees, and thought he was clever enough to get away with it. As for me, the IRS whistleblower program entitled me to a percentage of the money they recovered. I received a check for $345,000, 15% of the amount the government collected from Marcus Henderson's assets. It wasn't enough to retire on, but it was enough to give me options. I used part of it to start my own financial consulting practice, helping small businesses navigate federal compliance requirements. The irony wasn't lost on me. I also used some of the money to set up a scholarship fund at the local community college for students studying accounting and business ethics. The fund is named after Marcus Henderson's father, the man who built Henderson Manufacturing with integrity and hard work, before his son destroyed it with greed and arrogance. Sometimes people ask me if I regret reporting Marcus to the federal authorities. If I feel guilty about destroying a company that had been part of our community for 40 years. The answer is simple. I regret that it took me 3 years to find the courage to do what I should have done immediately. Marcus Henderson chose to steal from the American people. I chose to stop him. And that Tuesday morning, when he fired me for being too expensive, that was the best business decision anyone ever made for my career. My name is David Mitchell. I'm 59 years old, I run a successful consulting practice, and I sleep better at night than I have in 5 years. Justice, it turns out, is the best retirement plan of all.